settle in and let your breathing slow like a metronome you do not have to watch. The room you are entering is bright in the tired way, all soft humming lights, warm paper, and the faint smell of pencil dust. You think this is the age of machines doing everything for you? Wrong. Tonight, the computers are human, and your job is to turn motion into neat rows of numbers that behave. Here, in the quiet corners of the space race, you learn the gentle discipline of checking and rechecking until the math feels like a lullaby. With the Sleepless Scientist keeping watch, you will drift through trajectories, atmosphere, reentry heat, and the slow handoff from hands to circuits, one calm calculation at a time. You step fully into the calculation room, and you realize the sound is not silence. It is a soft industrial hush. Fluorescent lights buzzing like lazy insects, a ventilation system sighing through grates, and the steady, dry chatter of mechanical keys. Somewhere, a desk calculator is clearing its throat, clicking and clacking, then pausing as if it forgot why it started. You thought a computer would be a glowing box. It is not. It is you. And the person 2 desks over, and the woman with a stack of graph paper held like a small shield. It is anyone who can keep a straight face while turning the universe into arithmetic. The first thing you touch is paper. It is slightly rough, warm, from someone else's hands. Your pencil feels too light for what it is asked to do. You are handed a sheet with columns that look harmless, almost domestic. A few headings, a few units, a few blank spaces waiting politely, and then you notice the labels: velocity, time, distance, angle, motion. The kind that does not forgive you for being tired. A supervisor, the kind with a tight smile and looser empathy, tells you the same thing everyone gets told. Work carefully. Write clearly. If you do not know, ask. If you think you know, check anyway. Then check again, because your first answer is always the one your brain wanted, not the one the rocket deserves. You sit down. The chair creaks once, like it is complaining on your behalf. Your desk has a slide rule, a straight edge, and a stack of tables. Trigonometric tables, log tables, atmospheric tables, pages and pages of pre-chewed math prepared so you do not have to reinvent it at 2 in the morning. This is what people forget when they talk about the space race. They imagine roaring engines and bold speeches. They do not picture a room where the most dangerous thing is a smudge of graphite on your palm, and the most heroic act is erasing a digit before it becomes a disaster. You begin with something small, a step, then another step. That is how the rocket becomes predictable. Not because anyone truly controls it, but because you take the smooth curve of its journey and you break it into tiny pieces your hands can manage. You write down a starting point, position as a set of coordinates, a time as a moment you can name, a velocity as a direction plus a speed. The rocket is a story in 4 lines of ink, and you are about to tell the next sentence. On the desk beside you, someone is running a mechanical calculator. It is a heavy machine, the kind that wants commitment. You push a key, and the machine answers with a hard click, like it is offended you asked. You pull a lever, and it whirs, gears turning, numbers shifting behind glass. It is not fast, exactly. It is persistent. It will do the same thing all night without losing patience. Unlike you. You compute the next step. The rocket moves forward. Gravity pulls down. Air pushes back. The numbers adjust. One line becomes a column. One column becomes a page. One page becomes a stack that smells like wood pulp and mild panic. The calm part, the part that lulls you, is the repetition. Write, calculate, copy, check. Underline the result. Initial the margin. Pass it to someone else so they can try to prove you wrong. That is the culture here. You do not seek praise. You seek a clean disagreement before the rocket ever leaves the ground. Because a mistake on paper is just embarrassment. A mistake in flight becomes smoke and history. And a sad meeting where everyone speaks softly and nobody mentions sleep. You learn quickly that the room is built around routine. The same forms, the same units, the same careful handwriting. There is comfort in that. It is the comfort of a checklist and the quiet threat beneath it. This is how you keep a fragile vehicle honest, by refusing to let your mind wander too far ahead. But your mind does wander anyway. It wanders because the numbers, if you stare long enough, start to turn into motion you can feel. You imagine the rocket as a point, a small, stubborn dot. You imagine Earth beneath it, enormous and indifferent. You imagine the rocket trying to leave and gravity answering with the same old reply, "Come back." Gravity is not angry. It does not have to be. It is simply consistent. It is the dependable antagonist of every launch, always pulling, always present, never impressed by ambition. And the only way you deal with a consistent antagonist is with consistent accounting. You do not calculate the rocket's whole future in one heroic equation. That would be romantic. It would also be a great way to hide a mistake. Instead, you take small steps, a method that is boring on purpose. You start with what you know now. Then you apply the forces you can estimate. Then you ask where you will be a short moment later. Then you do it again. It is like walking through a dark house with a flashlight. You cannot see the whole floor plan. You can only see enough to not trip. If you keep the beam steady, these tiny steps have names: integration, numerical methods. It sounds grand until you do it for the 10th hour straight. Then it sounds like what it is, adding and multiplying over and over until you have a curve. Sometimes the step is 1 second. Sometimes it is a fraction of a second. The faster things change, the smaller your step must be. The rocket does not care that you are human. When acceleration spikes, your pencil has to keep up. You use approximations because approximations are honest. They admit what you can handle. They are manageable, and most importantly, they are easy to verify. In a room like this, verification is a kind of bedtime prayer. You will do the same calculation someone else does, independently. You will compare results. If they match, you are both relieved and vaguely annoyed, because it means you have to keep going. If they do not match, you circle the difference and begin the quiet ritual of finding the error. This is called checking the check. And then sometimes, when the stakes feel sharp, you check the check of the check. It is not distrust, it is respect. Respect for fatigue, for distraction, for the way a brain can swap digits like it is tidying a shelf. You are not battling incompetence. You are battling biology. The room has a rhythm to it, not music, something slower, the sound of papers sliding, pencils tapping, the clunk of calculators, the occasional cough that everyone pretends not to hear. Somewhere, a clock ticks, but it is not dramatic. It is just another steady thing in a room full of steady things. You glance at a table of values, sines and cosines laid out like a menu. Angles become ratios, ratios become distances, distances become a path. Trigonometry is the language you use when you cannot touch what you are measuring, which is most of spaceflight. You cannot grab the rocket in midair and drag it onto course. You can only predict and nudge and predict again. The slide rule sits beside your hand like a quiet companion. It is smooth with worn edges. You slide it, align marks, read off results. It gives you multiplication and division by turning them into addition and subtraction. A clever cheat, using logarithms, using the fact that the universe allows patterns. The slide rule does not give you perfect answers. It gives you answers that are close, and close is acceptable. If you understand the error, if you track it, if you do not let it grow wild. Error is always with you, like dust. You cannot eliminate it. You can only manage it. So you keep significant figures. You note rounding. You write small reminders in the margins. You treat your own work like it is suspicious, because it is. A person across the room is drawing a curve on graph paper, a careful arc like a slow wave. They are turning equations into something you can see. In the glow of the desk lamp, the curve looks gentle. It is easy to forget. It represents a machine moving faster than sound. You are here in this office that smells like paper and hot wiring, because the rocket's path is not intuitive. It is not even one curve. It is a patchwork of phases: powered ascent, coasting, staging, orbital insertion, correction burns. Each phase has its own math. Each has its own opportunities for embarrassment. You work one phase at a time. You take what the rocket is doing and you pretend you are the rocket. For a moment, you become a point mass. That is the flattering term. A point mass, meaning your whole complicated body, your fears and hopes are reduced to a dot with a number attached. Congratulations, you are finally simple enough for engineering. You start with acceleration. Acceleration comes from forces. Thrust is one, gravity is another. Drag, if you are still low in the air, is another. You calculate net acceleration and you update velocity. Update velocity and you update position. Position changes, so gravity changes, so drag changes. Thrust changes as fuel burns. The story keeps rewriting itself, and you keep following along, one small line at a time. You learn to love the things that are predictable. Gravity, for example, has manners. It follows a rule. The farther you are from Earth's center, the weaker it gets. Not by a little, by the square of the distance. That sounds abstract until you feel what it means in the equations. Double the distance and gravity drops to a quarter. It is the kind of scaling that feels like magic until you realize it is just geometry, the same force spread over a larger sphere. This is one of those facts that makes you feel calm and slightly insulted. The universe has rules that never change, and you still have to work overtime to keep up. Drag is less polite. Drag depends on air density, on speed. on shape. It changes when the wind shifts. It changes when the rocket flexes. It changes when the air warms. Drag is the atmosphere reminding you that Earth is not eager to let go, which is why, even in a calculation room, you can smell the sky in the tables, because there are pages devoted to air, atmospheric density at different heights, temperature profiles, pressure, all the soft, invisible stuff that turns deadly when you move too fast through it. You keep your pencil moving because you are not paid to philosophize. You are paid to make the next step match reality closely enough that the rocket does not have to improvise. But the mind, especially at night, loves to attach meaning to repetition. You find yourself thinking about the people in this room. They are called computers. It is a job title. It is also, in a quiet way, an insult. A computer is supposed to be reliable, tireless, interchangeable. That is what management wants. A human who behaves like a machine. Yet the room is full of small signs of humanity. A sweater draped over a chair. A coffee ring on a document that should not have coffee rings. A tiny photo tucked beside a stack of tables. The irony is that the very thing making you dangerous, your human fallibility, is also what makes you valuable. You can notice when a number looks wrong. You can feel when a result is unreasonable. A machine will happily produce nonsense at speed. You will produce it more slowly, but you might catch it. So you keep catching it all night. There is a particular kind of fatigue that comes from precision work, not the fatigue of running, not the fatigue of lifting, the fatigue of keeping your attention inside a narrow lane while your brain tries to wander off into daydreams. Your eyes dry out, you blink more. The pencil leaves a faint smear where your hand brushes the page. The desk lamp warms your knuckles, and still you check, because small mistakes matter here in a way they rarely do in ordinary life. A misplaced decimal point does not just ruin a spreadsheet. It can shift a trajectory. It can change a burn time. It can turn a safe corridor into a hard angle. In spaceflight, wrong is not a philosophy. It is a location. One of the older computers, older in experience if not in age, tells you quietly that the best habit is to assume you are wrong first, not in a self-hating way, in a procedural way. Assume you are wrong, then prove yourself right. You nod and you keep working. You do not see the rocket. You see its shadow cast into numbers. A trajectory table is a kind of shadow puppet show. The rocket moves and you translate that motion into columns. Time, altitude, speed, dynamic pressure, heating rate. Each one a different way to describe the same stubborn fact. The vehicle is moving through a world that wants to tear it apart. A few desks away, someone is plotting a guidance curve. They speak in low tones about an equation, about fitting polynomials, about smoothing a function so it does not ask the engine to do the impossible. Even the math has to be physically reasonable. You cannot tell a rocket to turn instantly. It is not a thought. It is a mass, with inertia, with flex, with fuel sloshing in tanks like impatient water. Sometimes you pause and you listen to the mechanical calculator again. It whirs, then stops abruptly, as if it finished chewing. The operator reads the result, writes it down carefully, and taps the paper twice, like anchoring it to reality. That tap becomes another sound in the room's lullaby. The minutes pass in soft blocks. You learn The small etiquette of this space. Do not interrupt someone mid-calculation. Do not borrow a table without asking. Always write units. Always write units. People say it like a charm against evil, because a number without units is a trap. Feet or meters, seconds or minutes, pounds, force or newtons, the universe does not care what you call things, but your paperwork does. A mismatch can slide through the cracks, quiet and lethal. Someone tells a story in a low voice, not to entertain, but to warn. An old case where unit conversion went wrong, and the result looked plausible enough to pass. Plausible is the enemy. Plausible means you stop checking. So you keep the ritual, you do the math, then you do it again another way. You estimate in your head, roughly, to see if the result feels sane. You compare to previous cases. This is not glamour. This is carpentry. You are building a path from pieces that must fit. And the odd thing is, once you sink into it, it starts to feel calming. Not because the stakes are small, they are not, but because the work is clear. There is a problem. There is a method. There is an answer that can be tested. The universe, at least, is consistent. Management is not. Schedules are not. Budgets are not. But gravity and inertia and the stubbornness of air, they show up every time. So you find comfort in them, the way you might find comfort in a storm that is at least honest about what it is. And once your eyes adjust to the steady rhythm of numbers, you start noticing what those numbers are really trying to describe. Motion. Motion is not one thing. Motion is layers. Motion is a straight line that becomes a curve because Earth is beneath it. Motion is a curve that becomes a spiral because the planet rotates. Motion is a path that looks clean on paper and messy in air. To predict it without fancy machines, you turn the grand, continuous sweep into something discrete, a sequence, a marching line of moments. You are handed a new sheet, and this one is more explicit about it. Time step, delta T. That means you pick a small slice of time and you pretend the world behaves nicely within that slice. It is not true, but it is useful. And usefulness is what keeps rockets out of the ocean. You begin. At time 0, you have position and velocity. You compute acceleration from gravity and thrust and drag. You update velocity. Then, position, over and over. You write the same symbols until they become shapes in your mind. The rocket climbs. The air thins. Drag relaxes its grip. Gravity is still there, but it weakens slightly as altitude increases. You learn to appreciate that gravity is not a wall. It is a gradient, a slope. You do not escape it so much as you climb into a region where it is less intense. The word escape is dramatic. The physics is less so. Escape velocity is simply the speed you need so that as you coast upward, gravity never pulls you back enough to stop you. Even that is not really escaping. It is just not returning. You do the numbers and you realize how much of rocketry is bargaining with energy. You spend chemical energy to gain kinetic energy and potential energy. Speed and height. You trade fuel for options. The rocket is an argument made of burning oxygen and metal. Your job is to make sure the argument has punctuation. A colleague shows you an approximation method used when time is short. Simplify drag into a manageable form, Treat gravity as constant for a short segment. Linearize a curve. This is not cheating. This is survival. You can always refine later, if time allows. But for a first pass, you need something you can do by hand. Something that does not require a room of machines you do not have yet. The joke whispered in the room is that the math is sophisticated and the tools are not. A slide rule, a pencil, and a brain that wants sleep. Congratulations! You are doing orbital mechanics with office supplies. To keep yourself from drifting, you anchor your work in simple truths. If thrust points up, you gain altitude. If thrust points sideways, you gain horizontal speed. If you gain enough horizontal speed, you stop hitting the ground, because the ground curves away. That last part is the trick that makes orbit feel like a magic spell. You fall, and you keep missing. But even before orbit, even during ascent, you are already thinking about curves and misses, because the rocket does not go straight up for long. It cannot. Straight up wastes energy, fighting gravity too directly. The efficient path is a gravity turn, a slow tip from vertical toward horizontal, letting the rocket build sideways speed while it climbs. That tip is gentle on paper. It is a few degrees, then a few more, a curve you can draw with a calm hand. In reality, it is a controlled struggle against stability and wind and bending forces. The rocket is tall. It wants to flex. It wants to wobble. The air wants to shove it sideways. Guidance systems fight to keep it pointed where it should be. And you, in your chair, fight to keep the numbers aligned. You learn that the rocket's path depends not just on how hard it pushes, but on when it pushes. Timing is everything. A burn now is not the same as a burn later, because later your speed is different, your position is different, your direction is different. In orbital mechanics, direction matters as much as magnitude. That is an elegant way to say the universe cares which way you point your effort. A small impulse at the right moment can change an orbit. A large impulse at the wrong moment can make a mess. This is why the room loves rituals. Rituals create timing. Timing creates predictability. You pass your page to another computer for an independent run. They do the same steps with their own pencil, their own fatigue. You both arrive at the same result, or you do not. When you do not, the process becomes almost tender. You sit together quietly and trace through each line. No blame, at least not out loud. Just attention. You find the discrepancy. It is almost always something small. A transposed digit, a sign error, a minus that became a plus because someone's mind was already dreaming. You fix it. You initial the correction. You keep going. The work does not feel like a race in here, even though outside, politically it is. In here, it feels like a long night shift at the edge of something enormous. A quiet person near the back mentions that the rocket is essentially a moving coordinate system problem. You laugh softly because that is what everything becomes eventually. Coordinates and time, where and when. The entire drama of the space race reduced to bookkeeping. And then, because your brain enjoys irony, you realize that is not an insult to the achievement. It is the achievement. To coordinate a machine through atmosphere and vacuum, to meet a moving target in orbit, to come home again, you need bookkeeping so careful it borders on devotion. The pages pile up. The night deepens. And as you spend long enough following invisible arcs through space, you realize the air above you is not empty. It is layered and fussy. You look at the atmospheric tables again, but now they feel less like background. They feel like a personality profile. The sky has moods, and it changes its behavior with altitude. At ground level, air is thick, heavy, crowded. It presses on you from every side. You do not notice because your body presses back, but a rocket notices immediately. Air density is the first bully a launch vehicle meets. Dense air means more drag. More drag means more heating, more stress, more wasted energy. That is why rockets hurry through the lower atmosphere, like someone leading an awkward conversation. You trace a finger down a table. At a few miles up, pressure drops. Higher still, it drops again. The numbers tell a story of thinning, of molecules growing more distant, less eager to collide. The atmosphere is not a wall you pass through. It is a gradient you climb, a slow fade from thick to thin. But even thin air can hurt you if you move fast enough. Drag is not just about density, it is about speed squared. Double the speed, and the drag force rises by roughly 4 times. All else equal. That square is what makes fast travel expensive. It is what turns a simple breeze into a punch when you are moving quickly. You think about the phrase frictional heating, which people say casually. Friction is part of it, but the deeper truth is compression. When you shove air out of the way at high speed, you squeeze it, and squeezed gas warms up. The atmosphere fights you by heating itself against you. It is very efficient. Nature usually is. You begin to understand why engineers care about gentle details like wind shear, a sudden change in wind speed or direction. With altitude, it sounds like something you could ignore. It is not. Wind shear can push on different parts of a tall rocket differently. The top feels one wind, the bottom feels another. The vehicle twists, it bends. Guidance corrects. The correction can amplify the motion if it is mistimed. A quiet oscillation can become a violent one. So in the calculation room, air is not just air. It is a moving field that has to be anticipated, not argued with. Someone hands you a chart of atmospheric layers, and you read them like a bedtime taxonomy. Troposphere, stratosphere, mesosphere, thermosphere. Each layer has its quirks. In the troposphere, weather lives. Turbulence, clouds, storms. In the stratosphere, things calm down and temperature shifts differently. Higher still, the air is so thin it barely remembers it is a fluid, yet it still matters to a fast vehicle. Even a calm-looking sky is full of motion. Currents sliding past each other, pockets of warm air rising, cold air sinking. The planet breathing heat from day to night. The rocket must pass through all of it while pretending it is flying through something uniform. That is the lie the math tells. A useful lie, refined with margins of safety. You are asked to help with a simple model of drag for a certain ascent profile. It is not the most detailed model. It cannot be. You do not have time for that, and you do not have enough machine help. So you use coefficients. Drag coefficient, a number that hides the complexity of shape and flow. Reference area, the effective cross-section, and density from your tables. You compute dynamic pressure. That is the pressure felt by a body moving through air. It scales with density and speed Squared engineers watch it closely, because dynamic pressure is what bends things. There is a point in ascent called maximum dynamic pressure, max Q, where the combination of speed and density makes the air shove strongest. The phrase max Q sounds neat and technical. In human terms, it is the moment when the rocket is being bullied the hardest. Your numbers will tell the flight controllers when that moment should happen. They might throttle the engines down to ease the load, then throttle back up when the air thins. Even the roaring ascent has moments of restraint. This is another thing the space race does not advertise. The best way to survive sometimes is to slow down briefly. Even when everyone is yelling, "Go faster," your pencil continues to scratch. You compute heating rates. You estimate temperatures. You mark where materials might soften, where seals might fail, where vibrations might worsen. And you realize that heat is not just a re-entry problem. Heat begins on the way up too, in the thick air, in the fast climb. The atmosphere is a soft blanket that fights you. It cradles you, gives you oxygen, lets you speak and sing and sleep, but try to punch through it at high speed, and it becomes a grinder. It is not personal. It is just fluid dynamics. You look down at your hands, a faint gray sheen of graphite, paper dust on your fingertips, the tools of your era, humble and stubborn. And you think about how the atmosphere is also humble and stubborn. It is just gas, mostly nitrogen and oxygen, with traces of other things. Yet it can shred a vehicle, heat it, twist it, and force entire teams to treat it like an intelligent adversary. It is almost funny, in a tired way, that humans plan to conquer space, but still get inconvenienced by air. You finish a set of calculations, and you pass them along. Another sheet joins the stack. Your eyes linger on a number that represents density at a certain altitude, and you picture it. Molecules farther apart, fewer collisions, less drag. Less drag means less heat. Less heat means the rocket can afford more speed. But heat does not go away. It waits. Because speaking of heat, you eventually get assigned to the part of the journey where the spacecraft has to come home through fire, politely, and on schedule. The paper they give you now looks different. Fewer tidy columns, more warnings hiding in the margins. You are no longer predicting how to leave Earth. You are predicting how to return to it without becoming a brief educational flash. Reentry math is the kind of work that sounds heroic in a museum and feels like accounting for a controlled house fire. You do not calculate whether the capsule will burn. You calculate how it will burn and whether the burning stays politely outside. You look down at the first variable that matters, and it is not altitude. It is not speed. It is angle. Flight path angle is a small, picky number, a slight tilt relative to the horizon. On a form, it looks harmless. In the sky, it is the difference between a survivable blaze and a very expensive meteor. Too steep, and the capsule hits thick air like a fist into wet sand. The deceleration spikes. The heating rate climbs fast. The air in front of the heat shield compresses, and that compressed air turns into something that behaves like hot glass. Too shallow, and the capsule skims. It meets the atmosphere, dips in, and then climbs back out again, like a stone skipping on a lake, except the lake is made of air, and the stone is you. Congratulations, you have bounced off the planet. That is the first lie you have to unlearn. You think re-entry is falling straight down. Wrong. Reentry is a long, slanted negotiation with the upper atmosphere. The goal is to bleed off speed slowly enough that the shield can keep up, because the real enemy is not flame. The real enemy is energy. Up there, the capsule has an obscene amount of kinetic energy, motion stored like a debt. Reentry is the payment plan. You cannot pay all at once. You will go bankrupt in heat. So you spread the payment across time, across distance, across a corridor of air that starts thin and gets thicker. And because the air changes continuously, your pencil work becomes a slow portrait of changing conditions. At the top of the atmosphere, the molecules are so far apart, they feel hypothetical. But you are moving so fast that even a few stray molecules can sting. Each collision is tiny, and there are millions of them, then billions, then trillions. As the air thickens, the capsule is not plowing through air, it is colliding with a growing crowd at a speed the crowd does not appreciate. You see the term heating rate, and you remember that the heat does not come from friction like rubbing your hands. It comes from compression and shock. Air cannot get out of the way quickly enough. It piles up in front of the heat shield. Pressure rises abruptly. Temperature rises with it. The gas breaks apart into ions, a plasma sheath, a thin, angry layer of electrified air. From the outside, it glows. From the inside, it must not. The numbers you write are calm. The reality they describe is not. The heat shield itself is a quiet kind of sacrificial object. It is designed to lose, not all at once, gradually. Ablation is the word. It sounds clinical. It means the shield chars, cracks, and sloughs off, carrying heat away with the material like a bar of soap, surrendering layer after layer. You run your pencil over the concept because it is comforting in a bleak way. You are not trying to build something that never burns. You are building something that burns predictably. That predictably matters because behind the shield there is a thin wall, and behind that wall there are people wrapped in straps, trusting you, surrounded by switches and gauges that will not help them if your math is sloppy. So you calculate the heat load, not just the peak heat. Total heat absorbed over time. A slow accumulation. You estimate how the ablator recession progresses, how many millimeters disappear by the time velocity drops. You do not say millimeters out loud. You just picture it. A fingernail thickness of material deciding whether someone gets to come home. If the heat shield erodes too much, the underlying structure sees temperatures it was never meant to see. Aluminum starts to soften. Seals start to leak. Wiring insulation starts to degrade. Everything becomes a chain of quiet failures, which means the real reentry story is not dramatic. It is incremental, small losses adding up until they either stay contained or they do not. You have tables for this too, of course, not just for atmosphere, but for material properties. Specific heat, thermal conductivity, heat of ablation, the quiet vocabulary of things that melt. Someone in the room calls it thermodynamics. You translate it into human. It is the science of how the universe steals your warmth or gives you too much of its own. And because engineers do not like surprises, the reentry profile is planned like a slow descent into thicker air with a target deceleration envelope. Not too much, not too soon. G-forces the polite name for being pressed into your seat hard enough to feel your skeleton negotiate. On paper, you plot deceleration versus time. In your mind, you picture the astronauts' cheeks tugging downward, their breathing becoming work. The capsule does not care if they are brave. It cares if they remain conscious. The tricky part is that re-entry is not a single regime. High up, the air is so thin it behaves strangely. You are in a realm where the usual assumptions about smooth flow begin to wobble. Molecules collide with the heat shield and fly away without colliding with each other very much. Engineers call it rarefied flow. You call it the atmosphere pretending it is a vacuum. Lower down, the flow becomes continuous. Shock layers form more traditionally. Turbulence can appear, thickening the boundary layer, changing heating patterns. Small changes in angle of attack can shift where the hot spots land. Angle of attack, another small number with a big attitude. The capsule is not necessarily perfectly aligned with its direction of travel. It may fly slightly tilted to generate lift. That is another lie people like. They imagine capsules as cannonballs. Some are closer to that than others, but even a blunt capsule can make a little lift if you offset its center of mass. Just enough to steer the footprint, just enough to stay in the corridor. So, you calculate lift-to-drag ratio, low but not zero, and you consider bank angle, rolling the capsule to aim that lift sideways. A gentle steering wheel made of nothing but geometry and stubbornness. It all feels absurdly subtle. A tiny tilt at several miles per second. A small roll angle, yet those small choices move the landing zone across whole states. Your pencil scratches out a sequence. At each time step, you update speed, altitude, heating, deceleration. It is the same numerical march you used for ascent, only now the forces are different. Thrust is mostly gone. Gravity is still there, faithful as ever. Drag is now the main actor, pulling energy out of the system, turning motion into heat. It is almost poetic in the way a machine can be poetic, leaving Earth by turning fuel into speed, returning by turning speed into heat. The room's humor, when it shows up, is dry. Someone says re-entry is like trying to dive into a swimming pool without making a splash. Another says it is like putting your hand on a stove, but doing it with paperwork. You keep your eyes on the equations, because the heat shield does not care about jokes. It cares about margins. Margins become your religion. You build conservatism into the calculations. Higher heating than expected. Lower material performance. Slightly worse atmospheric density. The atmosphere itself is a variable because it expands and contracts with solar activity, with seasons, with weather patterns far below. The sky is never quite the same twice. It only pretends to be. So you consider dispersion, the spread of possible conditions. You do not get one clean trajectory. You get a family of trajectories, a cluster of possible fates. You calculate risk. And because this is a human system, you also calculate the effect of human choices. How late can the retro burn be? How much error can guidance tolerate? How much time is there to react if something reads wrong? The capsule has no room for improvisation once it hits the corridor. It is committed like a stone released from a hand. You can influence the entry interface conditions, but after that, physics drives the schedule. There is something almost calming in that. The universe does not do meetings. When you finish your set, you send it forward and you watch others do the same. A quiet pipeline. Each person contributes a small certainty, and the whole machine of certainty becomes large enough to bet a life on. Betting a life is what it is, no matter how gently anyone words it. And somehow, in the middle of this controlled inferno, you find the most comforting part: the inside conditions, cabin temperature, cabin pressure, humidity, the numbers that describe whether the people inside can breathe and think. You calculate how much heat leaks inward, how insulation responds, how long it takes for the interior to warm by a few degrees. Boring, domestic, almost insulting, while the outside is incandescent. It is like calculating whether the tea stays warm while the kettle is on fire. But that is the point. Spaceflight is mostly about protecting a small pocket of ordinary life. The entire machine exists to keep a fragile animal in an environment that is actively trying to cook it, freeze it, or pull it apart. So you keep computing, and you imagine the capsule as a small, stubborn seed falling through a storm of heat, carrying its tiny wet cargo. When someone mentions communications blackout, you nod without looking up. The plasma sheath can block radio waves. For several minutes, the capsule goes silent. Not because it is gone, because physics is inconvenient. A planned silence. That is what people tell themselves. In the control room, those minutes stretch. In the calculation room, the minutes become numbers you already saw coming. Predicted blackout duration. Predicted signal reacquisition altitude. You can almost see it, the capsule descending, glowing, silent, then finally shedding enough speed for the plasma to thin, and a voice crackles through. Humans love voices. A voice is proof the universe has not taken everything yet. And then, lower still, the violence eases. Drag drops with speed. Heating drops sharply. The capsule transitions from plasma to merely hot, from hot to warm, from warm to manageable. That is the arc you are trying to buy with your math. A peak you can survive, followed by a steady, merciful decline. A supervisor walks past and taps the page where you wrote an entry angle range. Their finger is clean. Yours is not. They say, quietly, "Do not let that corridor narrow too much. Keep the pilot's workload sane." Workload. Another soft word. It means do not force a human to thread a needle while their body is heavy and their instruments are jittery. So you widen the corridor where you can. You build in tolerances. You adjust assumptions. You run another case. All night you are trading certainty for flexibility, and then trading flexibility for safety, and then trading safety for mass, because every extra layer of heat shield weighs something. Mass is always the enemy. More shield means less payload. More payload means less margin. The entire business is balancing a scale that never stops moving. You write it all down, then hand it off, then start again. Because that is the pattern. And because you are human, you notice the odd contradiction. You are doing work that will be celebrated as daring, yet the work itself is cautious to the point of paranoia. That is the real style of spaceflight. Not boldness, reluctant competence. When dawn starts to lighten the edge of a window, you do not feel triumphant. You feel rubbed thin, like the heat shield, in your own way. Which is why, when you imagine the capsule finally slowing enough to deploy parachutes, you feel a quiet relief that is almost physical. Parachutes are another insultingly simple thing that saves lives. Fabric, cords, and air resistance. After all the rocket science, you come home under cloth. The numbers for parachute deployment are their own set of rituals. Altitude triggers, dynamic pressure limits, reefing stages to keep the opening shock from snapping lines. You cannot just throw a parachute into fast air and expect it to behave. Air is still fussy, even at the end, and once the parachutes bloom, the capsule becomes almost gentle. It sways, it descends. It is no longer a projectile. It is a suspended weight, returning to the world of weather and wind and gravity that feels normal again. Normal, as in survivable. You set your pencil down for a moment and notice how your hand aches, not from lifting, from holding tight. That is what this work does. It makes you grip the universe in small pieces until your fingers cramp. And after you have imagined that long, hot descent in enough detail to taste the charcoal that is not there, you start to wonder about the people doing this every day. How they stayed calm, how they kept their digits straight, how they kept from smuggling their own fear into the numbers. Because the capsule is not the only thing re-entering. Every shift, you re-enter the same room, the same fluorescent hum, the same pressure to be perfect while being treated like furniture. You look around again, now that the romance of fire has passed, and you see the human layer beneath the math. A lot of desks, a lot of tired eyes, a lot of hands that know how to erase cleanly. This work does not bruise you, not visibly. It wears you down like water on stone. The hours are long in a way that does not feel dramatic. There is no single breaking point. There is just staying late again, staying focused again, checking again, being corrected again, correcting someone else again. And the pressure is quiet, which makes it worse. Nobody needs to shout at you. The math itself is the shout. Because you know what happens if you miss something. You do not need to be told. You have seen the photographs. You have heard the carefully worded reports. You have watched grown men speak in measured tones about avoidable losses. So you work with the kind of attention that feels like prayer, except the God here is gravity, and it does not forgive. In this room, being right is not enough. You have to be right consistently. That is the torture. A supervisor might praise the group as a whole, the team, the division, the laboratory. But your name does not go anywhere. Your name stays on the margin of a page, in small initials, like a secret. There is a reason they call you a computer. A computer is not supposed to have a biography. And yes, many of the people doing this work are women. Many are young, sharp, and underpaid. Many are old enough to have learned the hard way that competence does not automatically buy respect. Some are mothers who will go home to a second shift that does not come with overtime. Some are Black women in segregated workplaces asked to perform precision labor in a society that cannot manage basic decency. They are expected to be flawless while being denied the ordinary courtesy of belonging. You can feel the unfairness in the small things. Who gets to speak in meetings? Who gets asked for their opinion? Who gets sent to brief the engineers? And who gets told to just run the numbers? Credit is another resource, like fuel, and it gets allocated with a bias so old, it feels like furniture too. In the early days, The path upward is narrow. Promotions exist, but they are not handed out evenly. Titles change slowly. Pay changes slower. And when people tell the story later, they often forget the hands that made the story calculable. But the hands remember. You see it in the way someone sharpens a pencil down to a tiny stub, refusing to waste anything. You see it in the way a woman keeps a second set of notes because she knows her calculations may be questioned more harshly. You see it in the way people keep their tempers under glass because anger would be treated as incompetence. So, the room becomes disciplined, not just mathematically, but socially. Everyone learns the cost of being noticed. The irony is that the work requires judgment. It is not mindless. You are not a machine. You are constantly deciding which approximations are safe, which errors matter, which differences between two results are rounding, and which are danger. That requires experience. It requires intuition built from thousands of lines of arithmetic. And yet the structure of the workplace often pretends you are interchangeable, replaceable, a warm body with a pencil. Congratulations, you have been made essential and invisible at the same time. You learn the specific pain of being responsible without being empowered. You are trusted to do the calculation, but not always trusted to explain it. And still, people find ways to create small islands of dignity. They teach each other. Quiet mentorship. A tip about catching sign errors. A habit of writing units in red pencil. A trick for estimating whether a result is sensible before you commit it to paper. They share snacks. They share thermoses of coffee that taste like burnt patience. They share the gentle relief of humor that does not travel up the chain. In the corner, someone keeps a radio low. Late night music mixed with static, the soundtrack of a country trying to outrun itself. Deadlines arrive like weather. Launch date, test date, review date. And when the schedule tightens, the room tightens with it. More overtime, more cross-checking, less sleep, more dependence on routine. Fatigue becomes its own variable. You can see it in the mistakes people start to make. Not big conceptual errors, small transcription slips. A 7 that becomes a 1, a decimal that drifts. So, the system responds with more checks, more redundancy, more people doing the same work twice. Redundancy is comforting until you remember why it exists. It exists because humans break. A machine breaks too, but humans break quietly. They keep showing up while their minds get slower. They convince themselves they are fine because they are still standing. The pencil still moves. And then they make a mistake that their rested self would never make. That is why the culture of checking becomes so intense. It is not just technical, it is compassionate in a strict way. It assumes you are tired, and it builds nets under your tiredness. But nets do not erase the feeling of being watched. Every sheet you hand in feels like a small performance. Handwriting neat, logic clear, steps shown. Because if something goes wrong later, the paper will be pulled from a file and your initials will be traced like a fingerprint. You will not be famous, but you may be blamed. So you learn to document everything, not because you love paperwork, because paperwork is armor. When people romanticize the early space program, they do not talk about armor made of carbon paper and careful margins. They talk about rockets. they talk about astronauts. But in this room, you learn that the space race is mostly an endurance sport for the mind, a slow burn, not unlike Reentry. The saddest part is how easy it is to overlook the work precisely because it is quiet. A rocket launch has sound and flame and spectacle. Your work has pencil scratches and the soft clack of a calculator. One gets parades, the other gets a time card. And yet, even with all that strain, the numbers themselves still offer a strange comfort, because the universe, unlike management, does not play favorites. Gravity will pull on everyone equally. Air will heat the shield the same way no matter who computed the profile. A differential equation does not care about your job title. There is a bleak fairness in that, which is why, after a hard night, you may find yourself preferring the company of physical laws to the company of policies. Physics is cold, but it is honest. So you keep going. You turn in your work. You file your pages. You watch someone stamp a document and slide it into a folder that looks too ordinary to contain a person's fate. And then, because your brain is always looking for a quieter place to rest, you start thinking again about the simplest comfort the math offers. Orbit. Not the glamour of it, the simplicity. The fact that orbit is just falling with enough sideways speed to miss. In the calculation room, orbit is where the numbers stop changing so violently. It is where the rocket's tantrum ends and the slow clockwork begins. You picture it now, the way you picture a familiar street. A capsule coasting above the planet. The Earth beneath, rolling along, indifferent, but predictable. To understand orbit, you do not need poetry. You need one stubborn idea. If you throw something fast enough, it falls, and the ground curves away under it. That is it. That is the trick. It feels like cheating, like a loophole in gravity, but it is just geometry meeting inertia. Inertia is the tendency to keep going in a straight line. Gravity is the tendency to curve that line downward. An orbit is the compromise, a continuous turning that never quite arrives. You run the numbers in your head the way you do now without trying. Speed for low Earth orbit is not a single number in your mind anymore. It is a sensation. It is fast enough that the world below would smear into a blur. Fast enough that a mistake becomes distance quickly. And the weird comfort is that once you are in orbit, you are not fighting gravity. You are surrendering to it in a controlled way. You are falling all the time. Congratulations, you have made falling a lifestyle. On paper, you model orbit with simple equations first. Circular orbit assumptions, constant altitude, constant speed. Then reality arrives, and you add the ugly parts. Earth is not a perfect sphere. It bulges at the equator. Its mass is uneven. Mountains, ocean trenches, density variations in the mantle. The planet is lumpy, and those lumps tug on your orbit like small fingers. So real orbits precess. They rotate slowly. The line of nodes drifts. The argument of perigee shifts. Those phrases sound like spells. They are just ways of saying your path around Earth will not stay put. You can predict the drift, though. That is the comfort. Even the wobble has rules. Atmospheric drag never truly disappears in low orbit either. There is still a thin haze of air, especially when the sun heats the upper atmosphere and puffs it outward. A spacecraft plows through that haze, molecule by molecule, losing energy. It is a very slow re-entry that can take days, months, or years, depending on altitude. So, you compute decay rates. You estimate how often reboost burns are needed. You track the way a small force, applied over long time, reshapes a path. This is one of the most important lessons orbit teaches. Small changes accumulate. A tiny error today becomes a large miss later. A small correction now can prevent a big correction later. It is gentle math, and it feels like advice someone should give humans more often. You also learn about perturbations from the moon and sun. Their gravity tugs on satellites, making slow changes. Tidal forces in space, stretching orbits slightly, shifting planes over time. Even in orbit, you are not alone. Everything pulls on everything. The universe is nosy. And because the Earth rotates beneath you, your ground track shifts each orbit. You do not fly over the same spot again and again. The planet slips under you like a conveyor belt. If you want to pass over a certain region at the same local time each day, you choose a sun-synchronous orbit. That is a clever use of Earth's bulge, using that uneven gravity to precess the orbit at a useful rate. You read that sentence on a technical sheet, and you appreciate the quiet audacity, using the planet's imperfections as a feature. It is a theme, really. Spaceflight is the art of surviving reality, not denying it. The calculation room treats orbit changes like gentle nudges, a burn here, a burn there. In orbital mechanics, a short burn is called an impulse, even though it may last several seconds or minutes. You apply it at a specific point, and it changes the shape of the orbit. A prograde burn, pushing in the direction you are moving, raises the opposite side of the orbit. Retrograde lowers it. Burns at perigee are efficient for changing apogee. Burns at apogee are efficient for changing perigee. Efficiency in space is all about timing. You do not push when you feel like it. You push when the geometry is ready. And when you get it right, the result looks almost lazy. A spacecraft drifts, then drifts differently. No drama, just a new curve. That is why the math in this room can feel comforting. It is calm power, but it is also fragile. Because once you are used to the idea of quiet falling, it is natural to look farther out, toward the moon. The moon sits there like a pale deadline, pulling gently, always moving, never waiting. And if you are going to meet it, you cannot just go straight at it. You have to meet it where it will be, days later, after it has continued on its own orbit. Which means lunar travel is not a chase, it is an appointment. You open a new set of tables, and you see ephemerides, lists of where celestial bodies will be at given times. The moon's position and velocity, written down like a schedule. It feels strange, treating the moon like a train you can catch. But that is what navigation becomes. Timing, patience, and modest corrections. A trip to the moon is mostly waiting inside a carefully planned curve. Long coasts, small course corrections, hours of nothing but the hum of life support and the slow drift of objects that were not strapped down. In the calculation room, those hours become entries on a timeline. Mid-course correction burn at this time, attitude adjustment at that time, communication window here, star sightings there. The spacecraft itself has limited computing power. Early on, much of the navigation relies on ground calculations, radio tracking, and human procedures. You send signals to the spacecraft and measure the Doppler shift, the change in frequency due to relative motion. The spacecraft's radio is a kind of beacon, and Earth listens carefully to the way the tone changes. From that, you infer velocity. From timing delays, you infer distance, range, and range rate. Simple ideas executed with painful care. And then there is optical navigation. Looking out a window or through a sextant, measuring angles between stars and Earth's horizon, between stars and the moon. The sextant feels like a relic, but it works. Geometry does not expire. You imagine the astronaut floating, trying to align a star with a mark, while the spacecraft drifts slightly. Their world is a small cabin, and outside is a black so deep it looks like the universe forgot to render it. They take a sighting, write down a time, and those numbers come back to you. To become more numbers, you convert angles into position estimates. You compare to predicted trajectory. You decide if a correction is needed. Most corrections are gentle. A tiny burn, a small change in velocity, and days later, the difference becomes thousands of miles. That scaling is why space feels eerie. It is quiet, but it amplifies everything. Communication delays add another layer of patience. Not enormous delays to the moon, but enough to be felt. You speak, and a moment passes, and then the reply arrives, slightly out of sync with your instinct. It makes the whole operation feel like writing letters to the future. You cannot grab the spacecraft and steer it. You can only advise it, then wait to see if the advice stuck. And the spacecraft itself is not just coasting in empty nothing. It moves through a gravitational landscape. Earth's pull dominates near home, then weakens. The moon's pull grows. The point where they balance is not a wall. It is a region. You hear someone mention the term sphere of influence. It is a simplification used for calculations, dividing space into zones where one body's gravity is treated as primary. You know it is an approximation, but it is a useful one. You cannot do perfect three-body dynamics on paper all night. You do patched conics instead, treating the path as segments, each under a different main gravity. It is like describing a road trip by saying, first you drive on city streets, then on the highway, then on rural roads. The transitions are messy, but the segments are manageable. So you plan a translunar injection burn. That is the big push that sends the spacecraft out of Earth orbit toward the moon. Injection sounds clinical. It is another word for commitment. You fire the engine at the right moment, usually near perigee, to take advantage of the Oberth effect. That is the principle, that burning when you are already moving fast gives more energy change for the same fuel. Again, timing is everything. You do not just add speed. You add speed in a place where speed is already high, and the energy gain compounds. You sketch the transfer trajectory, often a Hohmann-like arc, though real lunar transfers have their own flavor. The curve stretches outward, reaching the moon's distance around the time the moon arrives there. Meet. Do not chase. If you chase, you waste fuel. You arrive late. You miss. The moon does not care how motivated you were. And once you approach lunar space, you can either fly by or capture into lunar orbit. Capture requires another burn, retrograde relative to the moon, to slow down enough to be bound. If you do not burn, you simply swing past and fall back toward Earth, assuming the geometry is kind. The calculation room runs cases for each possibility, free return trajectories, where the spacecraft can loop around the moon and return to Earth without major propulsion. A safety net drawn with gravity. Safety nets are beloved here. They are proof that you can survive not just the plan, but the failure of the plan. You picture that free return path like a long thread. It goes out, loops, and comes back. A long, elegant mistake that still ends at home. This is why some mission designs favor it. If the engine fails at the wrong moment, at least gravity can still bring you back. Again, physics as comfort. But comfort is a relative term when you are talking about 3 days in a metal can, with limited water, limited oxygen, and the constant awareness that every system is a single point of failure until redundancy is added. Still, the mathematics of it is soothing because it is patient. The moon does not require speed so much as it requires waiting correctly. In those long coasts, little corrections happen. Mid-course burns to fix small dispersions. Adjusting the aim point, the closest approach altitude, the entry angle for lunar orbit insertion. You plan these with the same mindset you used for reentry, corridors, tolerances, and conservative assumptions. The spacecraft is not a magic arrow. It wiggles. Thrusters misalign. Fuel sloshes. Small errors in the initial burn grow with time. So you watch the state vector, position and velocity, like a nurse watching vital signs. And when you do decide to correct, you keep it small, because fuel is life. Everything out there is a trade. Use fuel to fix trajectory or save fuel for later emergencies. Spend attention now or risk panic later. Fix a tiny error early or accept a large error later when it is harder to fix. It is all the same lesson eventually. After enough waiting and listening, you realize something else is happening in the room over these years. The tools are changing. At first, you are the computer. Then you become the person who feeds a computer. Then the person who checks what the computer says. Then the person who tries to understand why the computer is wrong. The handoff from people to machines does not happen like a switch flipping. It happens like a slow migration. Early electronic computers arrive with a reputation and also a smell. Warm dust, hot metal, ozone. They sit in their own rooms, loud with fans, surrounded by technicians who speak about vacuum tubes the way doctors speak about organs. These machines are powerful but temperamental, like a new coworker who needs constant attention and still misses deadlines. They break, tubes fail, a single component dies, and a whole run collapses. The machine gives you output that looks authoritative and is complete nonsense because someone typed the wrong card. Punch cards become another kind of paper ritual. You do not just write numbers now. You punch them into stiff cards, stack them, and feed them into a reader that can misread if a card is bent. So the new workflow does not erase human effort. It reshapes it. Instead of longhand arithmetic, you do programming. Early programming is not elegant. It is detail work. It is telling a machine exactly what to do step by step. with no room for intuition. A human can glance at a result and think, that seems too big. A machine will not. So you have to build the intuition into checks, into validation cases, into sanity tests. You learn to run known problems first to verify the machine is behaving. A test trajectory with a known answer. A simple case where the orbit should stay circular. A ballistic arc that should match a table. If it does not match, you do not trust anything else it prints. Trust becomes a process, not a feeling. Humans in the room react differently. Some are relieved, some are defensive, some are quietly worried about what it means for their jobs. But the funny truth is that machines create more work at first, not less. Someone has to translate the physics into code. Someone has to debug. Someone has to interpret the results. And someone always has to verify. So the old culture of checking does not die. It becomes more important because now mistakes can scale. A human error in pencil work is slow. A machine-assisted error can be reproduced 1,000 times before anyone notices. The room learns new rituals. Version control, though it may not be called that yet. Documentation. Code reviews in the old-fashioned sense. Two people staring at lines of instructions and trying to imagine every path through them. You still initial margins. Now the margin might be on a printout with perforated edges, the paper warm from a line printer. The pace changes too. Instead of steady scratching for hours, you get bursts of output. The machine runs, then spits out pages. You scan them quickly, looking for anomalies. It is like waiting for a storm report, then reading it under fluorescent light. The older mechanical calculators still sit on desks because sometimes it is faster to do a quick check by hand than to schedule machine time. Machine time is a resource. It is booked. It is argued over. It is treated like a person with a calendar. And of course, the machines are not always available. So you live in a hybrid era. Half pencil, half electronics. In that hybrid era, you notice something about human computers that does not get celebrated enough. They are adaptable. They learned orbital mechanics in an office with paper tables. Then they learned to translate those mechanics into programs. They learned to become the bridge between intuition and automation. Some people move into roles like analyst, programmer, verifier. Some become supervisors finally. Some leave, exhausted, and are replaced by others hungry for work. The system keeps feeding on human attention, no matter what tools it uses. And as the tools change, the missions keep asking the same soft question in different forms. What does it take to keep a fragile body alive in an unkind place? Because even if the navigation is perfect, the spacecraft is still a tiny habitat that must behave like Earth in miniature, which means life support becomes its own universe of boring hero work. Fans, filters, valves, heaters, small devices that do not get parades. You think of oxygen first because humans are dramatic about breathing. But the truth is, life support is a web. Change one thing and something else changes too. Oxygen is consumed, carbon dioxide is produced, moisture is exhaled, heat is generated, odors accumulate. Microbes hitchhike on skin. A spacecraft is not a sterile capsule. It is a warm, damp box full of biology. So you track cabin pressure like it is a heartbeat. Too low, and you risk hypoxia, decompression sickness, fluids boiling at inconvenient temperatures, too high, and structural requirements get heavier, leaks become more dangerous. Oxygen percentage is another careful balance. More oxygen makes breathing easier, but it also makes fire behave like a demon. Pure oxygen environments have been used because they simplify systems, but they turn small sparks into disasters. Materials that smolder in air can flare in oxygen-rich atmospheres. So, every choice is a compromise between engineering simplicity and existential terror. Carbon dioxide removal is a constant chore. Scrubbers, lithium hydroxide canisters in early systems, chemical sponges that soak up carbon dioxide until they are spent. Spent is a gentle word. It means used up, dead, no longer helpful, like a coworker at the end of a double shift. You replace canisters or regenerate systems later with more complex hardware. But early on, it is consumables, a ticking inventory. Water is the same. Drinkable water, hygiene water, cooling water. Some water comes from fuel cells, a neat trick combining hydrogen and oxygen to produce electricity and water. It feels like alchemy. It is chemistry, and it comes with its own failure modes. Temperature control is quieter but relentless. In space, you cannot rely on air convection to move heat around. Heat does not rise. Hot spots linger. So fans become essential, not optional. They push air to prevent pockets of carbon dioxide from forming near a sleeping face. They circulate heat. They keep humidity from condensing in unpleasant places. If a fan fails, you do not just get uncomfortable. You get uneven atmosphere, fogging, moisture where it should not be, and carbon dioxide building up in corners. You realize, with a tired amusement, that in space you can die from something as boring as a broken fan. Congratulations. Your life depends on a motor the size of a sandwich. Waste management is the least glamorous system and one of the most psychologically important. Humans can tolerate danger if they can tolerate disgust. Spaceflight tests both. Urine, feces, sweat, vomit, all of it exists, even in heroic narratives. Early systems are crude, bags and hoses and suction. Later systems become more refined, but never truly elegant. There is always a smell somewhere, hiding under filters and good intentions. And then there is routine. The astronauts are given checklists, not because they are forgetful, but because stress makes everyone forgetful. Checklists are comfort blankets made of procedure. Wake, measure cabin pressure, log temperature, check oxygen partial pressure, inspect scrubbers, record water use. The same calm accounting you do on the ground continues in orbit. Just with more floating pens, microgravity changes the body in subtle ways, so monitoring becomes another kind of calculation room. Only now, the paper is replaced by telemetry and medical logs. Fluid shifts upward, faces puff, legs thin. The body thinks it is overhydrated and pees more, reducing blood volume. Then, when you return to gravity, you can feel faint because your cardiovascular system has adapted to a world without weight. Bones start to lose calcium over time. Muscles atrophy when they do not have to fight gravity. The vestibular system gets confused, and space motion sickness arrives like a rude guest. So, exercise becomes another routine, not for aesthetics, but to keep tissues from quietly giving up. Food is measured too. Calories matter. Nutrition matters. Appetite changes. Taste dulls and congestion from fluid shifts. Everything becomes a system, and every system becomes a checklist. It is not romantic. It is survival by boredom. And because boredom is protective, engineers design operations to be repeatable. They design the mundane to be reliable. But the mundane is still work. It still wears on people. It still adds to cognitive load. You think of the calculation room again, and you see the continuity. The same kind of mind is needed. Patient, methodical, willing to do a small task correctly 1,000 times. The space race is loud on television. In reality, it is quiet labor multiplied. And you are still in that labor now, as you keep moving through the story. There is more to say about how the machines took over, about how the roles shifted, about how trust was negotiated between pencil and circuit. And there is more to say about the fragile bodies inside the machines, about how they slept, how they drank, how they tried to feel normal while orbiting at a speed that makes normal a joke. But for now, your attention drifts back to the calculation room itself. Because after all this talk of capsules and corridors and life support, the most persistent force in the story is not gravity. It is time. Time measured in shifts. Time measured in deadlines. Time measured in the slow thinning of patience and the slow sharpening of skill. In the hours after midnight, you watch the room change its character. Some desks empty. Papers get stacked and clipped. A lamp clicks off. Another stays on. Someone rubs their eyes and keeps going. Because the work is not finished, and the rocket will not wait for anyone to feel rested. You notice in the way people move who is carrying invisible extra weight. The ones who have to prove themselves twice. The ones who have to be calm even when they are ignored. And that is where the story keeps tightening. Because the cost is not only paid in heat shields and fuel, it is paid in people, in long hours, and in the quiet understanding that if everything goes right, nobody will remember the names on the margins. So the margins become their own little cemetery of effort. Neat initials, tidy dates, and handwriting that has learned to hide trembling. And because the work is so quiet, you start to notice what quiet does to people. It makes them measurable. A supervisor can walk the aisles and read productivity in stacks of paper, in columns filled, in forms completed, in pages clipped and filed. It is efficient. And it misses the part where a human brain has to remain sharp, while the rest of the body begs for the kind of rest nobody budgets for. You watch someone rub their wrist, the way you rub yours after hours of writing. It is a small ache, but it is faithful. Like gravity, you watch someone else blink hard, then lean closer to a page, not because the print is small, but because fatigue makes the world feel slightly out of focus, even under fluorescent lights. And the room pretends this is normal, because deadlines enjoy being treated like weather. You do not argue with them. You bring an umbrella and keep walking. But the funny thing, the almost tender thing, is that the room also develops its own quiet defenses, a private language of sanity checks. Not the formal ones in the procedure manuals, the informal ones that get passed hand to hand like contraband. Someone teaches you to estimate an answer before you calculate it. Just a rough scale, just enough to know if the final number is absurd. Because absurd numbers are how catastrophe sneaks in wearing a lab coat. Someone else teaches you to look for certain patterns, like the way velocity should rise smoothly during a burn, or the way a heating curve should peak, then decline. If the curve kinks in the wrong place, you do not trust the ink, even if it looks official. There is a kind of humility to this, a willingness to admit that the eyes can lie, and the pencil can slip, and the mind can betray you without warning. So you build habits that make betrayal harder. You underline units. You box final answers. You write the same value twice in different corners of the page, then compare them later like a paranoid twin. You learn to love redundancy, even when it feels insulting. Because redundancy is the closest thing this work has to mercy. The pay, meanwhile, has its own arithmetic. Hours multiplied by rate minus the invisible tax of being considered easy to replace. Some people are paid less because they are women. Some are paid less because the workplace has a long memory of prejudice. Some are paid less because the world thinks careful work is somehow less heroic than loud work. And still, these are the hands that keep the loud work from turning into funerals. You do not say that out loud, not here. Here you say things like, "Let us run it again." Here you say, "I think the sign is wrong." Here you say, "Can you check my assumptions?" Soft phrases used to hold back hard consequences. The pressure has a strange effect too. It makes people loyal to each other in a way they cannot be loyal to the system. They share techniques, they share warnings, they share stories about mistakes that nearly got through, not to shame anyone, but to remind everyone that the enemy is always fatigue wearing your own face. And then, slowly, over years, the most exhausting part happens. Not the overtime, not the deadlines, the transition. Because when electronic machines get better, the room does not become less important. It becomes less visible. The same way a foundation becomes invisible once the house is built. You watch the job title shift. Computer becomes programmer. Programmer becomes analyst. Analyst becomes something like support staff in the public story. The machines get the spotlight. The people get moved one layer deeper into the building. And now, after all this time, sitting with trajectories and heat and survival systems, you feel the story tugging toward its gentlest phase. The part where nothing explodes, nothing burns, and everything depends on small, quiet corrections. The part where spaceflight becomes maintenance. Because once a human is up there, orbiting, breathing recycled air, drinking measured water, the mission is not just physics anymore. It is housekeeping under absurd conditions. You picture the spacecraft interior again. Tight, crowded, a place where every surface is either a tool, a storage panel, or a restraint you have to clip into, so you do not drift away from your own work. And you, in your mind, take on the role the astronauts hate the most, the role of the thing that needs constant care. You become the air. Not the romantic sky air, the functional cabin air. The air that must be mixed, filtered, warmed, dehumidified, and kept moving so it does not form invisible puddles of exhaled CO2. In microgravity, air does not politely circulate on its own. There is no warm air rising away from you, no cool air sinking. Your exhale can hover near your face, like an unwanted thought. So, fans do the work gravity usually does for free, and that makes the fan a life support component, not a comfort component. A simple electric motor and some blades working quietly hour after hour, keeping the cabin from developing dead zones. Dead zones? The phrase sounds dramatic. The reality is more boring. A corner where air exchange is weak, where CO2 can build up slightly, where someone might feel headachy and slow and not know why. Space does not always kill you with spectacle. Sometimes it tries to kill you with mild symptoms. So you imagine the routine check, a gauge reading, a number written down. The same kind of work you did at the desk, only now it is happening in a tin can above Earth. Cabin pressure is kept within a careful range. It cannot be too low. At low pressure, oxygen still has to have enough partial pressure to get into blood. That is the real requirement. Not just pressure, but oxygen availability. The phrase partial pressure sounds like a technicality. It is not. It is the difference between your lungs doing their job and your lungs working overtime for nothing. If pressure drops too far, you have other problems too. Water boils at lower temperatures. Your saliva has opinions about that. So do your eyes. Congratulations. You have learned that boiling is not a heat problem. It is a pressure problem. And yet, high pressure brings its own discomforts. Stronger structure, heavier hull, more stored energy behind any leak. A puncture becomes a faster event. The system becomes less forgiving. So the spacecraft is a compromise in metal form. Then there is temperature. In orbit, you swing between sunlight and shadow, not slowly like day and night on Earth. Quickly, like walking in and out of a freezer every hour. The spacecraft's skin heats under sun, cools under darkness. Inside, you want stability. The human body likes stability. It likes being allowed to forget it is a chemistry experiment. So you move heat with loops of coolant and radiators. Heat does not vanish. It must be carried somewhere, then dumped. Radiators are the quiet organs of a spacecraft. Panels that do nothing but glow in infrared, leaking warmth into the void, because the void is the only place big enough to take it. If you cannot dump heat, it accumulates. Electronics get hot, batteries degrade, people get uncomfortable, then impaired. So you picture the coolant line, a pump pushing fluid, a valve opening and closing, a thermostat with all the excitement of a kitchen appliance, except failure means the cabin becomes a slow cooker. And water. Water is always the story in the background. Water is heavy. Water is precious. And in early missions, water is mostly a one-way stream. You take it with you. You drink it. You exhale it. You lose it. Later, recycling becomes more sophisticated. Condensate collection. Filtration. Chemistry that makes yesterday's breath into tomorrow's drink. This sounds disgusting because it is, and because it works. Humans can adapt to many things if the system is reliable and the taste is acceptable. Taste, by the way, becomes a bigger problem than people expect. In microgravity, fluids shift upward, nasal passages feel congested, and food tastes bland. So astronauts want stronger flavors, spicier sauces, more salt, more tang. The body wants sensation when the world is a padded box full of checklists. And checklists are everywhere. Because in space, memory is not a virtue. Procedure is. You do not rely on feeling. You rely on written steps, confirmed steps, repeated steps, the kind of steps that feel dull on Earth and feel sacred in orbit. Flip this switch. Wait. Confirm this light. Log this reading. Verify flow rate. Verify pressure. Verify again. There is a reason the space race produced so many manuals. Paper was cheap. Failure was not. And yet, even with good air and good water and good heat control, the body still complains. Bones do not like being unnecessary. Muscles do not like being underemployed. The cardiovascular system does not like being freed from the constant work of pumping blood uphill against gravity. So the body starts economizing. Blood volume decreases, muscles weaken, calcium leaches from bones. Over time, the skeleton pays a quiet tax for living in a world where weight is optional. Exercise becomes mandatory, not as a hobby, as maintenance. You picture it, a person strapped to a treadmill so they do not float away, running in place inside a capsule. The image is both funny and a little sad. All that effort just to remain ordinary. And then there is sleep. Sleep in a spacecraft is not the soft surrender it is in bed. It is scheduled. It is strapped down. It is done in a bag, so you do not drift into a wall or a coworker. Even the act of resting becomes engineered, which means the people on board and the people on the ground share something, a relationship with time measured in procedures. So now, as the night in the calculation room stretches forward, you feel the story leaning toward its final mode. Not a grand finale, just a soft deceleration. Because the loud parts of the space race were always supported by quiet rooms like this, and quiet systems like fans, and quiet habits like writing units twice. You imagine the room again? Late, later than anyone should be awake. The fluorescent lights still buzz. A few desk lamps cast warmer pools of light. The paper stacks have grown. A trash can is full of pencil shavings and eraser crumbs, the snowdrifts of careful work. Someone stands at a filing cabinet, sliding folders into place with slow precision. Each folder holds a slice of a mission, not the romance, the numbers. You realize that even the act of filing is a kind of trajectory planning. Documents have destinations, paths, storage, retrieval. The whole building is a machine for remembering. And remembering is another form of life support. Because the moment you forget a hard-earned lesson, the universe is happy to teach it again, with interest. So the room builds institutional memory the way the spacecraft builds cabin atmosphere, through circulation, filtration, and constant monitoring. A newer engineer comes in, looking to awake for this hour, carrying a printout with machine results. They want a quick check. They want a human eye. The machine has produced a set of values that look clean. The engineer trusts them because the machine is a machine. You do not trust them yet because you have lived through the era where machines are powerful and wrong with confidence. So, you scan the numbers the way you scan a horizon for weather. You look for continuity. You look for the unreasonable jumps. You look for the kind of error that comes from a misplaced decimal or a swapped unit. And you find it, not dramatically, just quietly. A value labeled in one unit, treated like another. The sort of mistake that could slip through because it looks plausible. Plausible, the enemy again. You mark it, you hand it back, and the engineer's face tightens with the sudden knowledge of what almost happened. They thank you, and they leave. No applause, no announcement, just one more prevented disaster vanishing into the air. That is the job, and you, sitting there, feel the strange comfort of competence. Not pride, exactly. Something smaller. A sense that the universe can be handled in pieces if you keep your hands steady. You think about the phrase, human computer again, and how it always sounded like a demotion. But in the quiet hours, it also sounds like a truth. A computer is a thing that computes. And you computed. You kept pace with rockets using paper. You kept people alive using margins. You kept trajectories honest using rituals. It sucked. In all the ways work can suck, long hours, low credit, constant scrutiny, and the subtle drain of being treated like a tool. And still, it mattered, not in the way speeches matter, in the way bolts matter, in the way seals matter, in the way a fan motor matters when you are breathing in a box. The room does not change quickly, but it does change. Over months, more printouts appear, more machine time is allocated, more of the arithmetic moves into code. People who once filled pages now fill card decks, then tapes, then terminals. The pencils remain because pencils are forgiving. A pencil does not crash. A pencil does not require a technician. A pencil does not care about your access privileges. But slowly, the stacks of hand calculations thin. Not because the work disappears, because the work migrates. Verification becomes the new craft. Instead of doing the full computation, you check assumptions. You validate outputs. You compare simulation results to known analytic solutions. You build test cases like fences around the machine's enthusiasm. This is less visible work, but it is more necessary than ever, because as systems grow complex, it becomes harder for any one person to hold the whole thing in mind. Complexity is a kind of fog. It makes you think you are safe because you cannot see the cliff. So, you become a fog cutter. You take machine output and ask the most boring questions in the world. Does this make sense? Does it match previous runs? Does it conserve energy where it should? Does it obey physical limits? Boring questions, saving lives again. And the workplace culture, too, shifts in tiny ways. More people get credit for programming. Some of the women who were once called computers become programmers because they were always doing logic anyway. The tool changed, not the mind. But the obstacles do not vanish, they just evolve. A woman can write brilliant code and still be called support. A black mathematician can solve a navigation problem and still be asked to use a separate bathroom. The mission can reach the moon, while the building cannot reach basic equality. The universe, indifferent, watches it all without comment. And maybe that is why the physics felt comforting, because physics does not pretend. A force is a force. An error is an error. A leak is a leak. In the final hours of a shift, you start seeing the room as a spacecraft in its own way, a sealed environment full of warm bodies and moving air and humming lights, a system that needs maintenance. Coffee is its coolant, paper is its consumable, sleep is its missing spare part. People cycle in and out like crew rotations, night shift to day shift. One group hands off to the next with brief notes and tired jokes. Handoff is a delicate art. You do not just leave. You transfer context, because context is another form of life support. You leave notes in margins. You leave warnings about assumptions. You leave little arrows pointing to where a future reader might stumble. You do it because you have been the future reader. You have sat down at a desk and tried to reconstruct someone else's thought process from faint pencil marks. So you write clearly, even when your hand shakes slightly from fatigue. You draw boxes around key values. You circle anything that could be misread. Legibility is kindness. And now, the building itself begins to feel like it is slowing down. Not because the space race slowed, because the hour is late enough that even ambition has to yawn. A janitor moves quietly with a cart, emptying trash cans with the discretion of someone who has seen too much paperwork to be impressed. The floor wax smell mingles with pencil dust and warm electronics. You watch them pass, and you think about how every system has invisible work. The janitor keeps the room usable. The technician keeps the machines running. The secretary routes memos. The computer fills pages with numbers. The engineer turns those numbers into a decision. The astronaut turns the decision into motion. Everyone is part of the chain. And chains do not care about fame. They care about links holding. You sit back slightly and look at the pile in front of you. It is not a monument. It is not art. It is labor. But it is labor that translates the indifferent universe into something navigable. And that is why, even when it sucked, people stayed. They stayed because the work had a clarity most jobs do not. It had rules. If you do the math right, the rocket tends to behave. If you do it wrong, it tends to teach you humility in the worst possible way. So the room fosters a certain kind of personality, cautious, persistent, detail-loving, and quietly stubborn. The kind of personality that can keep a straight face while someone says, "We need these by morning." Morning, the blunt instrument. And as morning approaches, you start to feel the room's mental weather change. Less conversation, more finishing, more clipping stacks together, more stamping, more final reviews. People do not want to take unfinished work home in their heads because unfinished work follows you into sleep like a mosquito. So they push to close loops. They write final notes. They ensure that anyone picking up later will not have to guess. Guessing is what you do in games, not here. Someone at a nearby desk is working through a final check on a guidance table. Their pencil moves slowly now, not because they do not know what to do, because they know exactly what fatigue does to confidence. They pause at each step, eyes half-lidded, then continue. You understand that pause. The pause is a safety device. Then, in a small moment that feels almost ceremonial, they set the pencil down, straighten the paper stack, and slide it into a folder. It is done. Done does not mean celebrated. It means ready to be consumed by the next stage of the machine. You watch that folder leave the desk, carried away like a sealed capsule. And you think about how much of the space race was simply moving information from one place to another without dropping it. Information is fragile. It breaks when copied. It degrades when reinterpreted. It warps under pressure. So the whole operation is built to move information reliably. That is what those rituals were. That is what the checking culture was. That is what the margins were. A system for preserving truth long enough to be useful. And when you zoom out, when you let your mind drift a little above the building, above the city, above Earth, You see the same pattern at every scale. The spacecraft preserves a pocket of breathable air. The calculation room preserves a pocket of reliable numbers. Both are habitats, carved out of environments that would otherwise kill you. Space kills you quickly. Bureaucracy kills you slowly. Both are uncaring in their own way, and yet here you are, still making pockets, still circling values, still underlining units, still trying to keep the inside comfortable while the outside behaves badly. That is what humans do. Not conquer, not dominate. Maintain. You gather your own pages now, the ones with your initials. You stack them, tap them against the desk to align the edges the same way the calculator operator tapped paper earlier, anchoring it to reality. You slide the stack into a folder and label it carefully. The label is mundane. A date, a run number, a mission phase, a tiny tag on a giant enterprise. Then you stand, and the chair complains again. That same creak, as if it is keeping your account. You stretch your fingers. They feel stiff, like they belong to someone older. The pencil dent on your fingertip is a temporary tattoo of the night. You look around the room, and you realize how many stories are sitting at desks like yours, in tired bodies like yours. Not dramatic stories, not the kind that get turned into posters, just persistence. And you start to feel, very gently, that the space race as it is remembered, the roar, the flags, the speeches, was built on a softer soundtrack. The scratch of graphite, the clack of keys, the hum of fluorescent lights, a fan, somewhere, keeping the air moving. The world loves to remember the ignition. It forgets the hours before it, when people sat quietly and made sure ignition would not become tragedy. So you step toward the doorway with the slow care of someone who has spent all night thinking about error propagation. Because even walking feels like a trajectory now, a path you do not want to misjudge. And as you move, you pass a bulletin board with memos pinned up, edges curling, schedules, announcements, reminders. They look ordinary, but they are part of the machine too. They are the atmosphere of the workplace, the invisible pressure that shapes behavior. You pause just long enough to read one line about a coming review, another deadline, another meeting where the loudest voices will speak and the most careful hands will stay quiet. Then you keep going, because for tonight, the only thing that matters is that the numbers are done, and done correctly, and filed where they will be found. Outside the room, the hallway is dimmer. The air feels cooler, like the building is exhaling. And you think briefly about how the astronauts will eventually come back down, and how the whole enterprise will eventually settle into something less frantic, and how the tools will continue to change, and how the need for careful human attention will stubbornly remain. Because even in a future full of computers, someone still has to ask, does this make sense? Someone still has to notice when a clean printout is lying. Someone still has to be tired and careful at the same time. You walk a little farther, and you hear the calculation room behind you fade into a softer, more distant hum. It keeps working without you, because the system is designed that way. Redundancy again, coverage, shifts, and you realize, with a quiet bitterness that tastes almost like amusement, that the room will be fine. The individuals inside it, less so. But the work continues, because it always does. You reach the point where the hallway turns, and you glance back once Not romantically, just reflexively, the way you glance back at a stove you turned off to make sure it is really off. The light under the door is still bright, numbers still being made, and somewhere above all of it, in the indifferent dark, a spacecraft is doing what your paper told it to do, falling around Earth on purpose, breathing air that a fan